Well, hello everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in. I'm Zineb, Riboua, Research Fellow and Program Manager of the Center for Peace and Security in the Middle East at the Hudson Institute. I'm very honored to be joined today by Dr. Brenda Shaffer, an internationally renowned expert on energy and foreign policy with a particular focus on natural gas trade, the Eastern Mediterranean, and the intersection of energy and geopolitics. Dr. Shaffer is a faculty member at the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School and serves as a senior advisor for energy at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, FDD, as well as a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center. She has authored several influential books, among them Operational Energy, co-authored with Daniel Nussbaum and Alan Howard. She also wrote Iran is More Than Persia, about ethnic politics in Iran, as well as energy politics in 2009. Her expertise spans from the Caspian region to Iran, Russia, and the strategic role of energy in global power dynamics. Dr. Shaffer, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Zineb.
Yeah, so let's dive right in. Why don't you give us just a big overview of the current strategic landscape? What is actually right now going on in the intersection of energy and geopolitics?
Right. So, one, there's a very big gap between how most of the Western powers and Western institutions or global institutions like the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF, International Energy Agency, the gap between sort of the picture of what they're projecting about the situation of energy in the world and the actual situation. So if you talk to almost, if you look at any publication on energy today, almost everyone is going to talk about the energy transition, like the with a capital T, like it's a fact. And most educated readers, they assume that we're in some sort of transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy. And the reality is that we're not anywhere, there's no signs of any imminent transition. And the fact that we're basing policies on a transition is very dangerous, because if you think that something's happening and it's not happening, that's a quite dangerous situation. Second, we have a really big gap between the behavior of most of the Western world on the energy issues and the axis between China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. So while most of the Western countries and institutions are trying to transfer from fossil fuels to renewable energy, they're trying to lower carbon emissions, they're trying to lower methane emissions. The other side is roaring ahead with fossil fuel production and consumption. And they're not in any sense reducing carbon emissions, and they haven't even agreed to reduce methane emissions. And this is leading to a situation where the West is getting more expensive and less reliable electricity, while its adversaries in China, Russia, and Iran, North Korea, are getting cheaper and less expensive electricity. And electricity is a major source of, it's a major factor in economic trends. It's a source of it can affect stability of a regime. It can affect stability of society. So on purpose, we're deciding to in a sense some sort of suicide where we're making ourselves more expensive and less reliable while our adversary is getting stronger. And it's not by chance, but where the American adversaries, especially China, are strongest at the United Nations, because this is like a consensus organization, and there's more countries connected to China, Russia, Iran bloc than there are to the United States. The United Nations, while it's not a scientific organization, is promoting this, this climate emergency. And producing the main data, even though they're not even a scientific organization, they're an inherent political organization.
Yeah. And so, just to go back, because I'm sure many people have never really thought about it as you framed it, that we're not in an energy transition moment, we are pushing for it. So do you see this, of course it is a strategic miscalculation. Western governments have really pushed for renewables, green energy policy, etc. Do you think it's been ideological this kind of push?
Well, I think, for some, they trust the international system, and if they're inundated with reports, information that there is an energy transition, I think, probably a lot of policymakers that are promoting this, it's sort of they're good-hearted and they have a good intentions, and people, if you take, for instance, what we're doing today with data, that like United Nations reports are a major source of data, even though when you think about it, there's no objective science about the United Nations in any topic. And there's nothing, it's an inherently political organization that reflects the power relations, of its members. And if you think of almost any UN agency today, it's not something, the United States is the largest contributor to the United Nations, and most of the institutions work against the United States, right? But most people don't see it that way. They don't really think about it. They just think, United Nations had something. Even if you ask journalists, they traditionally take the word of, in reports of NGOs and United Nations at face value. They kind of assume that there's something neutral about them. But if someone like from a business was quoted, they would say, well, a person that has an interest in oil or something like this. So we have this kind of naive approach to non-governmental organizations and to global governmental organizations. And then a lot of it, like how it's also fed, I believe, also by a lot of Chinese information. If you take, for instance, natural gas. For decades, natural gas was the solution. If you have a coal-fired plant somewhere, if you can replace it with natural gas, you're going to lower air pollution, so it's better for public health. And then for people who are concerned about carbon emissions, you're going to lower carbon emissions. Suddenly, 2018, 2019, suddenly all these reports that suddenly natural gas is very bad and we have to eliminate all fossil fuels with no real understanding why. And if I'm still sort of researching this deeper, but around 2018, it's when it became clear that the United States was the world's top producer of natural gas. It became the top exporter of liquefied natural gas. And around the same time, China's imports of gas increased, like the gap between them really deepened. And China realized around this time that it can't frack. At a certain point, they thought their geology also would be frackable, and they would be able to have also natural gas reserves, which there's a lot of basins around the world that they can conduct fracking, but it became pretty clear for a variety of reasons, their type of geology, water shortages, that they really couldn't have significant fracking. So suddenly you had to turn natural gas into something bad, and then suddenly we find out this whole thing why that natural gas is worse than coal, and on what? Based on what?
Yeah, so it's a mix of sabotage operation and information warfare against the United States energy independence.
That's what I believe. Yes.
Yeah, and so I mean now, how would you describe how that reflected in terms of weakening the West? If you had to illustrate it, what would you say on top of your head?
Well, first thing, you have deindustrialization in the countries that really went deep into the net zero. So, Germany is the best example where it's had, real, not just economic contraction, but closing of many of its industries. And, once they, if you don't, you can't have manufacturing, competitive manufacturing, when you have expensive energy. Europe has the highest labor costs in the world and the highest energy costs. So it can't compete, but certainly not in industrial sectors. So you're seeing a lot of Germany's industries collapse and throughout Europe, and some of them move to the United States where there's cheaper energy. Same thing in the UK, or some countries, their strategy for dealing with net zero was to export their food production, export their industry, right? So we're seeing, a country like the UK, which was like a bread basket or a lamb basket of, a dairy basket of Europe, and for itself, suddenly becoming a food importer. Because the farming, it creates emissions, and like countries and societies, like they're satisfied with this. Well, they can, someone else will be actually generating those same emissions, but as long as they're not, that's okay with them. But it's not, it's not really logical. other things is the unreliable energy and electricity. And I think even in the United States, not only because of climate policies, but a variety of policies, we really need to think about strengthening the reliability of our electricity. Three of the main population centers of the United States, California, New York, and Texas, have unreliable electricity, have blackouts, have a gap between the electricity they want to consume and what they have. And also our military energy supply lines run on our civilian ones. So if the US civilian sector is insecure, the military is insecure.
That's a very important point. And so, I mean, there is a huge shift now between the Biden administration's energy policy and Trump's energy policy. How would you describe this shift? And I mean, of course, for Trump, it's really about energy independence. He's been big on it since Trump admin 1.0, and now he's doubling down on it. It will have severe consequences on Iran, Russia, and others. And it seems that Biden administration's energy policy fortified Iran's game in this. Do you share the same assessment, or?
Right. Well, I think there's a couple things that we've had like a Obama administrations, and with a certain energy and climate policy. Then Trump undid it. Then Biden came and not only undid it, but turboed towards net zero in the United States and globally. Now Trump's undoing it, and I would think there's a couple consequences. One, the U.S. is not viewed as a reliable energy supplier. So like obviously Russia isn't a reliable energy supplier. Iran isn't willing to use energy for geopolitics. But the United States now falls in that category, because even if now Trump is undoing, let's say, the LNG exports, but a few countries have already, like when the Biden administration froze them, they said, hey, I can't rely on okay, even if Trump unfreezes, but then the next administration comes in and freezes again, I need to go to a reliable supplier. So actually you saw an uptick, for instance, of Japanese contracts with UAE, Qatar, Oman for energy. So that for gas, and once those contracts take place, you can't take them take them back.
Long.
Right, and so you're looking in gas supply, you're going to want 10, 12 years, 15 years. So you can't, even if Trump, he undid the halt of the LNG exports, but the damage was already done. Second, I think even with the climate initiatives, the Trump administration needs to think of something like much more global to undo it, because again, even 2 years from now, a different Congress can come into office. 4 years from now, a different administration, and just we'll go back to Paris Agreement. But we need like a really serious discussion with U.S. partners, allies around the world, for them to really have a more analytical look at everything they're doing with net zero and with climate.
And what is the impact then on U.S. foreign policy if the United States is seen as an unreliable partner?
Right. I mean, we even had, I'm not even sure if there's been yet an order to undo this, but I'm sure most embassies understand this. But in October 2021, the Biden administration gave an order to all the embassies and U.S. agencies not to engage in any policy discussions of fossil fuels. So it wasn't only just not to, give grants for them or loans, but it's actually you can't even discuss, energy security. So we already took a major toolbox out of our foreign policy toolbox. We took a major tool out because, for most American allies and partners around the world, the state of their energy security is really important, and fossil fuels are the bedrock of the energy we use today. So to not be able to discuss those, we already were sort of out of the game for 4 years. Others could say, well, we were big, the United States was big in the climate game, but again, this was a game that, well, maybe a lot of people felt really good about it, but it's a game that weakens the West, increase the power of our adversaries. And in fact, if you look at most of the US-based climate NGOs or environmental NGOs, they praise China for its great role, its green energy. And of course, many of them have offices in China, which means that they receive funds from China. Many of them receive grants from Chinese institutions. But even though China is like the largest emitter of carbon emissions, one of the largest, I believe the largest emitter of methane, or one of the top 3 of methane emissions, and huge pollution problem, air pollution problem from use of coal. And most of the hardware that they export to the West, like solar panels, wind towers, are produced by coal-fired electricity. And in fact, their electric vehicles that they're praised for their high numbers, you should think of them as coal-powered vehicles. Yeah. They're not electric vehicles. I mean, the energy source is coal. The product is electricity. So there's nothing green about the Chinese electric vehicle, fleet. So we need something much wider than just to just pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement, because that's not enough to reverse some of these very dangerous trends.
Yeah, I actually noticed something very interesting in relations to China, because in the West they have the message of you should go for green policy. This is a climate issue. Yeah. You do not, colonial West does not care about the environment. And then when I see them in Africa, in North Africa, it's more like, oh, you guys have oil and have many resources, and the West is telling you to not exploit it. And they're playing in a very smart way this double game. And I wonder if it's a real policy they're pushing for years.
Oh, that's a really interesting point. You should definitely write about that. That's very interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think that sounds exactly correct, and it's good you brought in the issue of Africa, because people who are against use of fossil fuels, they usually walk around that they're so moralistic. They care about the planet. They care about future generations. But these policies to cut production of fossil fuels and cut loans for fossil fuels, they principally hurt the world's poor. Unless you've traveled somewhere where people don't have electricity, or live somewhere where people don't have electricity, it's hard to understand this. So a lot of people, when they're sitting in the universities, they think if we dry up fossil fuels, then people will be forced to use renewables, and that's a very good thing. But for most of the world's poor, I mean, people have to use energy. They have to cook food. They have to purify water. They have to bathe. They have to use fire for to keep animals away, predators away, for some kind of illumination. And if you don't provide access to fossil fuels, or it's not affordable, they're condemned to burning dung, sticks, leaves, which is the biggest threat to human health around the world. It's highly polluting and highly carbon emissions much higher than fossil fuels, right? So if you don't allow natural gas, you end up with dung and wood. You don't end up with windmills. And if maybe you've traveled in places where they don't have electricity, and you see the smoke coming out of homes, and so natural gas with a little bit of methane is certainly better for these people and better for the planet than what regularly people use for electricity. And the idea that all energy was renewable prior to the mid-19th century, right? And that was not actually very clean. It wasn't that we had clean air from all the peat and wood and the lump coal that was being, and animal dung that was being burnt, and so I think there's a lot of misconceptions in that respect.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about Russia. It seems like Russia is obviously a petrostate. They really are dependent on energy and energy markets, and they also sees the weakness of the West in terms of energy policies. I've also seen reports that the Kremlin was actually supporting groups that was pushing green lobbies, I would say, especially in Germany and elsewhere. What can you tell us about how the Russians are playing this game?
Right. So definitely there's very strong evidence that Russians supported anti-fracking movements in Europe. And it was, pretty funny, like even Ukraine had in parliament passed a fracking ban, but before the first invasion. Bulgaria, which isn't known for its like strict climate policies, passed a fracking ban, and Bulgaria actually produces natural gas. It had prospects for producing, more natural gas, and throughout, I mean, Europe could actually does not at all need to import natural gas. Ukraine doesn't need to if they knew correctly how to develop their own resources. And so, yeah, I think in many ways, Russia supported anti-fracking in the West, and China now promotes information that exaggerates, the climate crisis, and in order to get the West to deindustrialize and have expensive electricity. So we have to see it in that adversarial sense, that there is a geopolitical aspect to it.
And also, do you see any cracks in Putin's energy strategy so far? Do you think they are seizing every opportunity that presents to them, or how do you see things?
Well, I think Putin relied on the fact that because of the energy dependence of Europe, that they wouldn't support Ukraine, and that was wrong. He was proven wrong. On the other hand, I think the fact that Russia didn't destroy the Nord Stream pipeline, which was pretty obvious that they're not going to destroy their own, sort of flagship project, right? But like a lot of the, as potentially the war unwinds and some kind of ceasefire comes and potentially gas, export is returned to Europe, I think some people in Europe are going to be upset that the Nord Stream was actually, destroyed. I mean, you have a very weird situation in European energy policy, and especially, they're very critical of the United States and the Trump administration now on this effort to bring to a ceasefire or peace agreement. But they stopped importing Russian pipeline gas, but they highly increased their imports of Russian LNG. So for Russia, this was fine. They make more money off of LNG than pipeline gas. So like, why not? Why not? And this is just like, again, like a thing, a pipeline you see a Russian pipeline, you can measure how much gas is going into Germany, is going into Europe. So they didn't want to do because publicly it wasn't acceptable. But importing liquefied natural gas into their, into their LNG ports, this they could do, and again, spend more money on that than pipeline gas.
Oh, very interesting. And so just to go back to China, now that the Trump administration has a new type of energy policy, much more aggressive, very heavy on independence, do you think that it will change the game in regards to China? Or do you think, as you stated before, that these things actually take time and that we need a more of a comprehensive strategy?
Mm-hmm. It's a good question. I'm sure China is going to use the climate policy as a way to try to divide the West, because here you have like nasty United States that wants to end the Russia-Ukraine war, and then also, it's not on board with the climate, and so like trying to use this issue to mobilize support in Europe and among other Western allies. I'm sure they're going to try to do that. I think something really important is also language. If we've learned over the last decade or so is that certain political camps use different language, and often I think the Republicans, conservatives adopt the language of the left without even thinking about it, like calling wind and solar green energy. Well, there's nothing green about covering a mountaintop, with wind towers and killing birds. There's nothing green about taking agricultural land and turning it into metal fields of solar panels. Natural gas, I think, it's a fossil fuel. What's wrong with fossils? What's not green about fossils? But I think that natural gas has a much lower environmental impact than solar, wind. Certainly, the most common form of renewable energy today is hydropower. Have you ever seen a hydropower dam?
No, I have not.
Okay, well, it's very exciting. But I mean, they completely destroy, whatever waterfall, lake. You take like a nice natural place, and suddenly it's huge concrete. It disrupts all the, the fish, the flora and fauna, the villages that live around the, the water source, and so it's really disruptive, so you can't really call it green. So I think we need to be very careful, and like also, most of the environmental organizations aren't environmental anymore. They're all about climate, and they've stopped caring about any, sort of traditional issues. If you think about it, today's environmental organizations are pro-mining, right? Because mining is how you get the components for electric vehicles, electric systems, right? Mining, anyway, all of us who've seen a mine, what it looks like is, again, not very green. Mining, in the past, environmental organizations, stood to stop mining, right? So now they're pro-mining.
It's very terrible for people who work.
And also for the health, especially in the outside the West, and especially in Africa, and then, or whales, when some people try to get reports about how the offshore wind is hurting whales, the environmental organizations really go after them, and lawsuits, like they become anti-whale, even so. I could say I was inspired by some of my own relatives that were like environmental activists, but at a very young age understood that they don't care, that the climate organizations the environmental organizations don't care about the environment anymore, because everything is about climate, even if that hurts the environment. So I think it's really important we don't use words like green energy, green policies, and we actually return to truly green policies, which are, low impact on open spaces. For instance, nuclear and fossil fuels are much more energy dense than today's renewable energy. So the renewable energy uses a lot more land, has more of an impact than than today's fossil fuels, and certainly than nuclear energy. So we need to think, what's open spaces, what's land, that's nature, right? We need to think about more traditional environmentalism and call that green, and not call the climate activity green.
Yeah, like a Rooseveltian type of environmentalism. And so, like, I know you pay a very special attention to Central Asia, to South Caucasus, and especially to Azerbaijan, especially in when it comes to its role in energy, in the energy sector. Why don't you tell us a little bit about it?
Right. So, Caspian, and most of or a significant number of the Caspian states, especially Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan, are oil and natural gas producers, and bringing the ability to, they're landlocked countries, and so the ability, the infrastructure to bring their natural gas and oil resources westward was important for energy markets, for global oil market. At the time, it somewhat, reduced the power of OPEC, which at the time had over 60, when their energy started to reach world markets, had, about half of the global oil production. It helped to shift that. Today, OPEC's about 37% of global oil production, so it's a very big shift. And bringing natural gas to Europe, which would help Europe to diversify off of Russian gas. But it also was a tool to help these countries be independent. Like if their main energy was going through Russia or Iran, they would not have been able to be these independent actors that they are today in the international system. And I think one of the most important geopolitical developments happening that few have noticed, I think you guys here at Hudson have noticed, but there's this rising alliance between Turkey, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and the states of Central Asia. And this is the first serious counterweight to China and Russia in the center of the Eurasian heartland. I think that this alliance is going to be a lot, or let's say at this point, a cooperation access, strategic access is going to be very important, and we should continue to watch it. And I hope the United States will jump on board and become support this strategic cooperation between these states. But it's really changing the geopolitical map in a very important region. Another thing worth watching regionally is the Iranian energy crisis, which again, I'm not sure. I'm not sure in Washington how much they've noticed, but Iran is having a true energy meltdown. Like they've had natural gas shortages before, they've had refined fuel products shortages before, they've had electricity shortages. They're having all three right now: electricity, natural gas, and refined products. And it's kind of in a loop, because if you're a refinery, and let's say you don't have a lot of refining capacity in Iran, right? Like let's say Iran has a lot of oil, crude oil, but you can't use crude oil in your car or factory, right? You need to refine, or for jets, you need to refine it, right? And so they don't have sufficient refining capacity, right? But if you have electricity disruption and your refinery can't operate, so it even lowers even more your refining capacity, right? So or if you have natural gas shortage and you have to close, factories, people can't get to work, people can't produce products, right? So all of it's like in a loop. And Iran has an especially sort of difficult energy crisis because it's not seasonal. Most places they have like high energy demand in certain seasons. Like let's say in Europe, the high energy demand is in winter because they have cold winters. The energy demand goes down in the summer, right? And then they can stock up during the summer. I assume a place like Morocco, high energy demand is in the summer for desalination and for air conditioning. In the winter, the energy demand goes down. Iran, it doesn't change because they have like cold winters plus very hot summers. So we're not going to see, just by the spring is not going to, change Iran's energy trajectory. Minister of Petroleum of Iran said that they need $45 billion of investment to get into a balance. So I don't see with what's coming from the Trump administration, I don't see, in any way that $45 billion coming from anywhere. So it means that they're in a perpetual energy crisis, lights out, highway lights around Tehran out frequently, schools frequently closed because their lack of heating, which in the summer would turn into, lack of air conditioning. And there is a link between demonstrations, riots, and electricity disruptions. We saw this in Egypt with the fall of the Mubarak regime and then of the Morsi regime. This was during periods of extensive blackouts. Recently in Bangladesh, a government fell when there was blackouts. So there is really a strong connection between blackouts and regime outs.
It's very interesting. I always, people talk about regime change, etc. But I always thought that because the Soviet Union collapsed, I think we also should prepare for a potential Islamic Republic collapse. I mean, they have issues recruiting in terms of their IRGC, Basij internally. They have issues recruiting outside because Hezbollah collapsed thanks to Israel. And because of that, there's a discourse in the Arab world where they say, here are the Iranians. They never helped the Arabs, and so you should not join them. And so they have now problems recruiting even outside. So it seems that they are in a very tough situation.
Well, I agree with you that this is one of the probably weakest periods of the Islamic Republic since the Iran-Iraq War. But it's also, therefore, one of the most dangerous periods. Like a wounded animal is, most dangerous. So I agree with you. On one hand, their whole strategy of proxies as their own defense fell apart. And I think, everyone was surprised by the fall of the Assad regime. I don't think, even the Russians and Iranians that were sitting in Syria had any idea that it was just going to implode in that way. In the same similar way that the Soviet Union imploded. It wasn't a revolution, it was an implosion. And the Israel demonstrating to them, something that I think Israel always knew they could do, but the fact that they could knock out their air defense, Iranian air defense with, basically nothing. And then I think you're already seeing somewhat of a succession crisis in Iran. You're already seeing disagreement among the IRGC commanders. And Khamenei himself, he's 85, ill. How good is his decision? When you count in sort of a deterrent situation, how good is his decision making right now? The fact that he fired ballistic missiles at Israel twice when they have no air defense, no credible air defense. Just to so you show off that you could do this, but if at all, it hurt Iran more than it hurt Israel, because it showed that even when it gives its best shot, it couldn't really, harm Israel. But at the same time, in this situation, Iran has a strong incentive to go nuclear very quickly.
Yes, yeah.
And again, and with this lack of good decision making at the top, with the lack of unity among the elite, this is very dangerous. That how will they? You can't count on them to, think about deterrence or what would happen after. Maybe Khamenei is a dying man. Maybe he'll just blow. He'll just blow up another country. Because he maybe that to him is the right. He doesn't have to think about the next step. So I think we're in a very, very dangerous period. And even though I agree that the regime is quite weak, especially because of this energy crisis.
Yeah, and it's also very noticeable in how they have been, they are taking a very aggressive stance against what you just described earlier, the Turkish, Azerbaijani alliance. They see it as a direct threat. Unfortunately, in Washington, D.C., it's not read that way. But would you also agree with that assessment?
Yeah, 100%. I think that one of the most underappreciated phenomena in Washington is the Turkish-Iranian rivalry, and that, well, one, because Iran and Turkey are, they in general, they don't easily turn it into a war of words. They're both, they've lived next to each other for millennium. So, so they're careful about things spilling to war. But I think also because many Westerners have sort of a cultural approach to foreign policy, they think, well, these are Muslims and these are Muslims, so they must share the same views and the same ideas. You grew up in the Muslim world, it's much more complicated. You've just seen sort of the exchanges of words between the Turkish foreign minister Fidan. And other Iranian foreign, officials, where Turkey was saying, if you continue to use, proxies in other countries, be careful because it's going to happen to you. And it's at the same, this is at the same time that TRT, the Turkish public television or government sponsored television, launched TRT Persian. And there's 30 million ethnic Azerbaijani Turks in Iran that watch Turkish television, will see Turkish movies, Turkish soap operas, are very influenced by Turkish culture. Their language, in many ways, is becoming even more, like Anatolian Turkish over the years through these communications. And so Iran itself is quite, vulnerable itself to ethnic separatism and it doesn't play it at all well. All it does is suppress the minorities. If you look in the last couple of weeks, Iran has sort of done a policy of against opposition of sticks and carrots. So towards the more secular urban opposition, like the university students and stuff, they've loosened up things. So they froze the hijab law. The parliament had passed a law for more strict hijab regulations, and they froze that. There was a murder at the Tehran University. The regime came in right away, investigated, made sure that it wasn't politicized. At the same time, they're having huge rounds of executions and incarcerations of ethnic minority activists, Baluch, Kurds, Azerbaijani Turks, and so it's towards the minorities, they're getting tougher. Towards sort of the urbanite, secularists, educated class, they're getting softer. It's not clear how that's going to play out.
It's a recipe for a disaster.
Yeah.
You also mentioned that you wrote a report recently that was published. If you can tell us more about it, I'm sure many people would love to read it.
Right. So this is part of I'm writing a book on energy and climate, a new book. Things have been busy. As always, book authors are way behind deadlines. But I wrote a sort of policy version of this book manuscript, and basically pointing out how the Western institutions, American allies, the climate and energy policies they're pursuing are creating national security threats to themselves and inadvertently to the United States, and about how our energy policies actually strengthen U.S. adversaries like China, Iran, and Russia.
Okay, great. Well, Dr. Shaffer, thank you very much for joining
Sure.
me today. I'm sure many people will not only read your upcoming book, but also your report. Thank you very much for joining me.
Sure, my pleasure.